runs past many lives. It leads its own parade in time. It has been here a near eternity, a source of change and wealth. It has been a sea of inspiration and war. It will witness and direct the future as it has our past. Another heaven and earth would have to pass before such a thing could be created again. And no other river has such a claim on our emotions and history as the Hudson. Begins in time. The rocks that flowed from the earth and covered ancient seas are worn in the 70 million years of the river's rushing. The river has known and cradled life. It witnessed the glacial northern ice that covered the world. And it too changed in the flow of time. But the river existed in its own terms, and we know it only in ours. To the different people who have known the river, it has meant different things. Man defines the time and space it occupies. We give it a name, the Hudson.
Even if man were not here, the Hudson River would still have nature's purpose. We're just a passing chapter in the river's history. It has plenty to do without us. I'm Anne LaBastille, an ecologist, a conservationist, and an Adirondack guide. The river begins in the high peaks area of the Adirondack Mountains, where few marks have been made by man. It starts way up on the shoulders of Mount Marcy in a little pond called Lake Tear of the Clouds. And from this humble beginning, the river meanders through rocky gorges and deep woods toward its main body, where it first becomes its own master. The Hudson is very powerful and frantic. Further downstream, when it reaches Glens Falls, the river gentles down and begins to feel the impact of man. And along with man's touch, there is the tainting of the water.
industries multiply now as the river moves southward. And as it approaches Albany and Troy, it is joined by the Mohawk, its largest tributary. At the high dam and locks at Troy, the river is first influenced by the sea. There are tides, even this far inland, and traces of the ocean salt in the water. South of Albany, the river widens. It flattens out and touches Catskill, Hudson, Kingston, and Poughkeepsie. In the Hudson Highlands are the great cliffs and hills around Storm King and Bear Mountain, and just south is Haverstraw Bay. The Hudson River flows southward to the Palisades and eventually the city. And then, finally, it enters the Hudson River Canyon, a deep trough etched into the continental shelf before disappearing into the abyss of the ocean.
The Hudson is roughly 315 miles long from its source at Lake Tear of the Clouds in the Adirondacks to where it reaches the Battery on Manhattan Island. It's a changeable river, from a high mountain torrent to a deep, implacable current. And of course, it's a beautiful river, especially up here in its wildness and its purity. And here, of course, there is that precious commodity, silence.
The first men to perceive and define the river called it Mahitchiktuk. And to them, the river was seen as a living power. These people of the river journeyed from the west some 6,000 years ago, and there is a legend that their god told them to journey eastward till they reached a river that flowed both ways, and that this would be a fertile land where their people would prosper.
There are no Indians living along the river now, but there was a time when there were many villages along its banks. My name is Gahadayan. I'm from a Seneca Iroquois village in upstate New York. I'm part Mohican, and the Mohicans lived in the northern reaches of the Hudson River. The people who lived in the valley before Western colonization were not really a nation, but rather they shared a common language, Algonquin. And the tribes that lived along the banks were the Lenni Lenape, called later by the English the Delaware. And from south to north, there were the Unalashtigo, then the Unami, and then the Munsee. North of them, they were the Sopas, the Mohicans, up to Albany. On the other bank were Wecquaesqueak and Canarsie to the south. Mahitchiktuk, or River of the Mohicans, was revered as a power. The villages were small, perhaps no more than 100 people living in any one settlement. And the smaller villages were simply kinship groups or extended families. And to these people, the idea of a nation in the European sense, or even in the context of the later Iroquois League, was strange. There were ceremonies directed toward harvest, what they got out of the water and the land. And the life of these people along the river seems, in retrospect, to be an idyllic one. By the time Western colonization began in earnest, the paradise, whether real or imagined, was gone. The Algonquin River Indians found themselves crushed between Western man pushing from the east and the south, and the Iroquois nations harassing them from the northwest. They were good fighters, some of the river Indians. My great-grandfather was a Mohican. I was told that when the French were given a choice between the Iroquois and the Mohican, they chose the Mohican as the better warrior every time. But the river Indians were not politically organized, and within 200 years after contact with Western man, they were exhausted. Emotionally, culturally, politically exhausted. Caught in between the vice of the Iroquois and the Europeans, they disappeared. Toward the end of their tenure, a Delaware spokesman said to the English, "You take the land. There's nobody living on it. We've lost ourselves. We've disappeared like a breath of homeless wind. There's nobody living here. You take it. One owaswat neho."
The first Western man to record seeing the Hudson was Giovanni de Verrazano, a Florentine navigator sailing under the patronage of Francis I of France. After charting the coasts of the Carolinas, Verrazano sailed north in the spring of 1524. And on April the 17th, his ship, La Dauphine, sailing before a soft southwest wind, entered what we now call New York Bay. This river he called the Great River, and the surrounding land he named Angoulême, in honor of the Queen Mother, Louise de Savoie, Duchess of Angoulême, and he recorded his discovery in a brief account. We passed up with our boat into the said river and saw the country very well peopled. The people are almost like unto the others, and clad with feathers of fowls of divers colors. They came towards us very cheerfully, making great shouts of admiration, showing us where we might come to land most safely with our boat. We entered up the said river into the land about half a league, where it made a most pleasant lake about 3 leagues in compass, on the which they rowed from the one side to the other, to the number of 30 of their small boats. And behold, a contrary flaw of wind coming from the sea, we were enforced to return to our ship, leaving this land, to our great discontentment, for the great commodity and pleasantness thereof, which we suppose is not without some riches. Fearing the winds that might destroy his ship in the Narrows, Verrazano left the harbor and sailed northeast to chart the coast of New England. He never returned to this land of great commodity and pleasantness, and his failure to further explore the great river was one of the missed opportunities in the exploration of the New World. But the river was discovered. The Dutch and English would follow. They would define it further. For the first European navigators, the Hudson was viewed as a possible route to the riches of the Orient. Even before Verrazano's discovery, John Cabot, sailing under the English flag, may have explored the great river. A Portuguese mariner, Estevan Gomez, sailing for the Spanish crown, noted the river in 1525 while searching for a northwest passage. There were probably other unrecorded visitors, but it was not until 1609 that Henry Hudson, an English navigator sailing for the Dutch East India Company, charted the river to present-day Albany. Europeans now realized that this was not a northwest passage, but as Verrazano had conjectured, it was a land not without some riches. In the 4 weeks that Hudson's Half Moon explored the river valley, Robert Jewett, a ship's officer, kept a detailed log of the adventure. He noted the corn and oysters, the beans and tobacco traded to them by the Indians. He observed that the lands were pleasant with grass and flowers and goodly trees as ever they had seen. As he charted the harbors, he saw many salmons and mullets and rays, breams, basses, and barbules. And at the Half Moon's northernmost river anchorage, the people of the country came flocking aboard and brought us grapes and pompions, which we bought for trifles. And many brought us beaver skins and otter skins, which we bought for beads, knives, and hatchets. The Dutch, being good businessmen, made the most of these observations, and they were to give the river a new meaning. By the mid-1600s, the patterns of Dutch settlement had taken form. Some forts and villages were established, as well as some farms and larger feudal land holdings called patroonships. But large-scale colonization of the river valley was never their primary purpose. The Dutch viewed the valley in terms of goods that could be traded in European markets, furs, lumber, and grains. And the river, which they called Mauritius, or the North River, was the road to these riches. In the 50 years they controlled the river, the Dutch never really consolidated their power, and, like the Indians before them, were soon easily displaced. A small British fleet in 1664 forced New Amsterdam to surrender. The city became New York. Fort Orange became Fort Albany. Wiltwyck became Kingston. And although the river was still referred to by many as the North River, the English preferred to call it after their countryman, Hudson's River. And, unlike the Dutch, the English successfully colonized the river valley. Although the Dutch assimilated somewhat with the growing English population, they retained a good deal of their own identity and character, and much remains of the Dutch in the valley, their homes, their names, and their legends. 200 years after the Dutch first came to the valley, one of America's first men of letters, Washington Irving, penned the Knickerbocker History, a whimsical satire which he titled A History of New York, from the beginning of the world to the end of the Dutch dynasty, containing, among many surprising and curious matters, the unutterable ponderings of Walter the Doubter, the disastrous projects of William the Testy, and chivalric achievements of Peter the Headstrong, the 3 Dutch governors of New Amsterdam, being the only authentic history of the times that hath ever been published. Washington Irving settled here at Sunnyside on the banks of the river. The writer himself said, "The Hudson is in a manner my first and last love. And after all my wanderings and seeming infidelities, I return to it with a heartfelt preference over all the other rivers in the world." Some of his most romantic tales were contained in a collection of stories called The Sketchbook, in which he made further use of Dutch characters and legends. It was here in the Highlands that Irving's Rip Van Winkle encountered the ghosts of Hendrik Hudson's crew, where the crash of their 9-pins echoed among the mountains like rumbling peals of thunder. And there are older legends. There is a ghost ship that hundreds of years ago was seen to enter the lower river, and although fired upon with cannon and carrying no sails, vanished into the upper river where, some say, it still can be seen on stormy nights. And there are other ghosts on the river. On a still night, the spirit of a young oarsman can be seen rowing endlessly on the river, condemned for eternity for having broken a Sabbath 200 years ago. And some believe another spirit still roams the valley, the same one Irving's Ichabod Crane encountered one dark evening centuries ago, the spirit of the Headless Horseman. river continues in time. Events and men change its meaning, but the definitions they give are often only for their moment.
The cemetery has been here for about 100 years, here on Mount St. Gabriel at Peekskill above the Hudson. But 100 years before that, this was a temporary home for the soldiers of the Continental Army. I'm Dana Link, an archaeologist, and this is my site where my students and I are excavating the remains of one of these barracks. Gun flints, the musket balls, the pieces of ceramics and pipe pieces that we may be coming up with. You come so much closer to the real history. You're touching something physical which was there. Prior to the war, the Hudson Highlands was looked upon as a barren wasteland, but with the war effort, it gained major strategic importance, and it had been referred to as the key to the continent by General Washington. If control of the Hudson had been maintained by the British, they really would have split the colonies and could have dealt with each section individually. The British campaign of 1777 involved three armies, one coming south from Canada, another going east from Oswego along the Mohawk River, and another coming north from New York. What happened was that the army coming from the west was defeated at Oriskany. The army from New York under General Howe failed to receive its orders and went to the Chesapeake instead, and the third army under General Burgoyne reached Saratoga. And at Saratoga, he was routed by the American forces due to not receiving the support from the other armies. While the Battle of Saratoga was going on, news of it reached General Clinton in New York, who had been left behind in place of General Howe. And Clinton tried to aid Burgoyne's problem at Saratoga by attacking the forts in the Highlands. He was entirely successful in this and gained the Highlands in a matter of a couple of days. After the Battle of Saratoga was over and General Burgoyne had surrendered, Clinton, feeling insecure in the Highlands and knowing that he could no longer help Burgoyne, left the Highlands and returned to New York City. And with that move, the Americans came back immediately and refortified in the Highlands, taking advantage of all their past mistakes, and in essence prevented the British from ever again having a chance for the Hudson River as they had before. The last attempt for the Highlands was by stratagem. It involved the turning over of West Point by its commander, General Arnold. General Benedict Arnold of the American armies felt that his activities, his valor, was not justly appreciated by the Americans. And feeling as he did so strongly, he conspired to turn over West Point to the British. This, again, luckily failed due to a number of simple reasons, the most blatant being that Arnold's courier, Andre, was captured at Tarrytown with notes from General Arnold dealing with the betrayal of the American cause. The events leading up to Andre's capture were rather complex and small, and yet had they not occurred in the way they did, the British would have gained the Highlands, and with control of the Highlands could have subdued the rebellion. It's interesting how so many small things can affect such a great cause. And just for that brief moment in time, the whole destiny of the American colonies hung on control of the river.
People have come to the river because it provides food, a place to live, and, for some, money. But in the back of almost every human being's mind is also just a little sense of beauty and a sense of the past. Seeger lives in Beacon on the Hudson. He has always loved the river and the boats that have graced it.
The people who lived here thousands of years ago, my guess is they felt very, very close to this river, as some people do today. And their canoes were not usually birch bark, but a dugout canoe, which we were trying to make one out here on the waterfront. My guess is, from the old pictures we've seen, that if one looked at the Hudson River almost anywhere between Albany and New York 100 years ago, it would have been dotted with sails. Little sloops, big cargo boats. You would have seen rafts with logs on them. It would have been fishermen's boats, occasional whaling ships. The Hudson River was just dotted with sails in those days, and the Clearwater is a replica of one of these mid-19th century sloops. The Dutch sloops were broad in the beam and bluff in the bow, like they say the Dutch women were. But in the 19th century, the ocean-going boats got too big to sail up the river, and a specialized form of sloop was invented. They were built for speed. Captain owned his boat. He'd pick up produce upriver, take it to New York, sell it, and then he'd have a list of things he had to buy. Well, here's Mr. Livingston wants to get a new stove, and somebody else has ordered 5 sacks of plaster. He'd go around, make his shopping list up, and drop them off. But 100 years ago, there were still 400 or 500 boats like the Clearwater that carried bricks, sand, lumber. Actually, most of New York's brownstone houses are built with materials hauled on sloops: Connecticut brownstone and Haverstraw brick, and Catskill lumber. But the steamboats first took the passenger business. Later on, in the 20th century, they took all the business. And the last few Hudson River sloops were towed away and sunk somewhere, rotted away in a mud bank. But ordinary human beings, no one claiming to be a genius, ended up creating some of the most beautiful works of art, I believe, that humankind has ever produced. I call the Clearwater a symphony of curves. There are very few straight lines on it. Even the mast bends in a strong breeze.
Ranzo me boys, Ranzo.
wanted to build a Clearwater, we showed the blueprints to a millionaire. He could have built the whole boat in 1 year and never missed the money. He said, oh, it's a beautiful boat, but what do you want to sail in the Hudson for? I sail in the Virgin Islands. Without knowing it, he'd given us our best reason for building the boat. Because there are people here who are not going to run away. And these people are going to save the Hudson. And people have come back to this river in spite of all the bad things that have gone on. I'm convinced that 100 years from now, this river is going to be very, very clean. Now, admittedly, it might happen in two ways. The human race is going to straighten up and fly right, and we'll get rid of pollution. Or we won't straighten up and fly right, in which case we're going to be back to the Stone Age in 100 years. This river will be clean as a whistle. It's noticeably cleaner, but has a long way to go.
Go out for a ride. I love the smell of fresh air in my air-conditioned Ford, but especially I like the scenery that I see along the road. Oh, see Rock City by Stucky's Pecan Bar. Drink Coca-Cola next time you stop your car. Buy my freshwater melon that I got at the A&P. You can ride down the line past 100-mile signs and never see a tree. Now I'm going back to nature on a brand new pair of shocks. Boing. I love to watch them little streams come trickling down the rocks. I love to see the birds and bees going in through the sky. But at 70, all I can see is letters 10 feet high. Oh, see Rock City by Stucky's Pecan Bars. Drink Coca-Cola next time you stop your car. Buy my freshwater melon that I got at the A&P. You can ride down the line past 100 miles of signs and never see a tree.
The river has produced great wealth, as does any natural resource. The lumber of the Adirondacks and Catskills, the revenues from trade and commerce on the Erie Canal. But often what remains of prosperous times disappears as quickly as the faces of dead merchants. There were the land controllers, the patroons of early centuries, the robber barons and railroad magnates of later times. And many who amassed great wealth chose the varied scenic beauty of the river as a backdrop for their affluence.
One of the charms, I think, of the Hudson is its diversity of scenery, for one thing, and its diversity of architectural styles.
Ben Fraser owns an antique shop in Cold Spring, but some of his favorite antiques can't be found here. They're old houses, and one of the notable ones he saved from destruction was Boscobel, an early 19th century mansion.
Well, I think an area which it has something from the past. It has absolutely no character at all. And I always felt that this area deserved a rather special effort. A large number of the early houses were, of course, farmhouses. There was the Dutch influence, the English influence, and Newport has that street of Huguenot houses. The interesting thing to me is that they were almost uniformly attractive, well-proportioned, and dignified, no matter how small they were. The 19th century houses did exhibit a much greater display of wealth, although they remained dignified and formal. I was motivated in the case of Boscobel by the fact that the building was unique. That there's really nothing like it in the whole country. And that it was so strikingly beautiful that it just shouldn't be allowed to be destroyed. We paid the rector $1,000 for it. And the government sold it to him for $35. So he made quite a nice profit without having to lift a finger. In the Victorian period, the river probably appealed to large numbers of people as a romantic and beautiful spot, harking back to the English standards of country places. Secondly, the Hudson provided the method of transportation to the country, and it was greatly enhanced by the railroad. Olana, I think, is possibly the high point of the Romantic period, in which Frederick Church, who had traveled a great deal, built a Persian or Moorish Victorian house. The situation is spectacular and romantic, and the whole place definitely should be preserved forever, because no one will ever see such a thing again. The Roosevelt House, the name of which is actually Springwood, started off about 1830, but it's been tinkered with and altered out of all architectural recognizance. The Vanderbilt House was built in 1895 or 1897 and is very definitely ostentatious. They didn't mind in the least letting people know that they had it. That really ends the great period of building of the Hudson. And I think it's very interesting that until certainly about the Depression, these large estates, particularly on the East Bank, they practically touched one another, almost from New York to Albany. And when they still ticked, as they were meant to do, the result was a magnificent parade. Well, that time is gone forever, but the houses remain, as long as they are maintained, as a pleasant reminder of this vanished era.
The source of the Hudson was not discovered until the last half of the 19th century. It's ironic, because the river had already been central to the lives of so many people and ideas, and yet no one had bothered to trace it to its beginnings. It's ironic also because the discovery of the source took place at a time when some men were occupied with taking wealth out of the land, while others, like the discoverers of the source, were evoking an image of the land that would extend into our present time and redefine man's relation to the natural world. In 1872, a surveying expedition under the supervision of an Adirondack guide, William Nye, followed the Hudson's headwaters back into the high country near the summit of Mount Marcy, and the director of the expedition, Verplanck Colvin, recorded the event in his notes. We commenced to ascend the stream, hurrying along on the slippery boulders, leaping from one rock to another. Suddenly before us, through the trees, gleamed a sheet of water, for there were Marcy's slopes beyond, while the water of the lake was studded with those rocks which we had looked at with our telescopes from Marcy. It was the lake, and flowed not to the Ausable and St. Lawrence, but to the Hudson. First seen as we then saw it, dark and dripping with the moisture of the heavens, it seemed in its minuteness and its prettiness a veritable tear of the clouds, the summit water, as I named it. The conservation movement, although its historic roots reach to men like Thoreau, took substantial shape by the late 19th century, and its basic question of what is man's proper relation to nature was shared by another 19th century movement that expressed its ideas in a different form.
The Hudson River School, as we use the term today, describes the landscape painters that developed around New York City during the middle portion of the 19th century. And if you're a landscape painter, you want to paint the nearest, most beautiful thing as a rule. I'm John Howitt. I'm curator of American paintings and sculpture at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. The role of man in the great majority of these landscape paintings is small or non-existent. Man is assumed by the artist to be the viewer and to be surrounded by nature. They believed strongly, in the Romantic tradition, if you will, that the hand of God was everywhere in nature, and it was their aim, their stated aim, to isolate, if possible, the essence of this godliness in nature in their landscape paintings. The great majority of the Hudson River School landscapes were produced between 1825, when Thomas Cole was discovered, through, I would say, 1875. The patrons for the landscape painters were primarily commercial men, businessmen who grew rich with the opening of the Erie Canal. And Thomas Cole's patrons were, one was a grocer who made a fortune. Another was a banker in Baltimore. It was such men that provided the support for the artists. The period from about 1875 through 1945, practically, the Hudson River School pictures languished in basements and museums and in homes all over the country because no one wanted to look at them. They were indeed in disfavor. I think the best of the Hudson River School paintings can be called great paintings. Of course, the taste and perception of quality in art changes from generation to generation. My personal feeling toward these pictures is that they are very beautiful indeed to me.
Charlie, how many of these have you gotten this year? Size? Is this the fourth or the fifth?
It's the fourth, I think.
What's the total length?
That can't be.
No, 7 foot.
7'4".
Although some stretches of the Hudson are still polluted, overall it's cleaner than it was a few years ago. And some fish have responded by increasing in number, such as the Atlantic sturgeon. And few men have contributed more to the river than writer-conservationist Bob Boyle.
You want to start cleaning it? You have to clean them in a special way because it's like a leather skin. How was the shad run this year, Jimmy?
Very good. It's not as good as last year. Maybe just a little
I don't think
less.
it was as good as last year.
Joe, what do you think of the meat?
I think it looks beautiful.
Why does it look beautiful?
Because it's pink.
Which means...
Because it's fresh. Yeah, it's fresh.
What different dishes will you make from it? Put mushrooms, shallots, a little white wine, a little Madeira. You could really treat it the same way you treat veal.
You told me they'd had bluefish up this
Oh,
far,
yeah, blues. Charlie was fished a lot for snapper blues last year. They were all over the river. I mean, the river is loaded with fish. I think, properly managed, you'd probably feed Japan out of this river. But the point is, it would take another heaven and another earth to pass, to come again before you could recreate these biological components of the river system.
River is very symbolic of life. A river is born, a river reaches maturity, a river dies. I think the appeal of a river, and the appeal of a river such as the Hudson, is very strong to many people, particularly to the river fishermen at for plank. Charlie White goes out for sturgeon, not to make money at it, but like Ahab going after Moby Dick. It's their holy grail, it's their passion. And men who work very closely with nature, such as Charlie White and Jimmy Carey and the other fishermen at Verplank, really feel as though they have their hand on the pulse of God.
But the hands of other men are still strong on the river. Where some pollutants are removed, new ones appear, like the industrial chemicals referred to as PCBs, the presence of which in fish make them inedible. And the river, which is necessary to the lives of so many people, is threatened again.
No river in American history has more devotees than the Hudson. Devotees of all kinds, from the sturgeon fishermen at Verplank, to turn back the clock, to Thomas Cole and the artists of the Hudson River School. A feeling for nature in this country was born on the Hudson River. Winslow Homer did his finest watercolors when fishing the upper Hudson River in the Adirondacks. It's always brought forth a deep response from man. Washington Irving writing his folk tales, modern-day conservationists, or just the everyday person who happens to look at the river. He would have to be utterly devoid of feeling to journey along the river valley and not be moved by what he sees.
The river exists without us, as it has for millennia. But without it, to reflect and act upon, our past and our future would be less. Continues in time and defines its own reality, even as it gives itself endlessly to the sea.
When the wind's away and the wave away, that crazy old fool will get down on the bay, dodging the ledges and setting his gear, and come back when the wind drives him in. Yet he knows full well the fishing is done, his credit's all gone and the winter is come. But as sure as the tide will back on the bay.